Welcome to On the Move. Today I'm hosting three very amazing women, Franziska Grillmeier, Katy, Fallon, and Petra Molnar. Thank you guys for being here. And so today we will talk about EU's migration policies at its external borders. And particularly, we will look at the reception of refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine. But also, I hope we will discuss the hypocrisy of EU's response to people seeking refuge in Europe. According to UNHCR, more than 3 million people have left their homes and crossed over to neighboring countries and onwards. Most of the people from Ukraine have arrived in Poland, but the arrivals to Romania, Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia are much lower in comparison, but still ongoing. And today I will do my best to speak less because you guys know way better than I do. And in the last few weeks, you were actually on the borders of Ukraine and moved through different borders of Ukraine to monitor and report the situation. So I'm more interested in hearing your experiences, your thoughts, and in a sense, your assessment of the things. So I will first actually start with Katy, because you just got back from Poland. And we will talk about how the situation has started, but let's start with the most recent, context. And maybe you can tell us, like, what happens when people arrive in Poland or elsewhere. I see that there is also mobility to different EU countries, as the directive allows people to choose which EU member state they will seek protection. But I also read from your reports that certain cities, such as Warsaw and Krakow, are starting to struggle. And I read similar issues in Berlin, that Berlin already has kind of been beyond its capacity to help support accommodation of people in the city. So what are the challenges at this point facing in these cities are facing, and how do you see and foresee the challenges that are awaiting these places as the war seems to continue and will continue for another long time?
Yeah, so when people first cross over, they obviously arrive at the border crossings. For example, in Poland, they'll immediately arrive across the border on foot or car or by train. And then they often make their way via car, via bus, via train to two of Poland's bigger cities, Warsaw, its capital, and Krakow. And then it's a question of them arriving at the train stations, which have become these big hubs of people trying to figure out their next move. There's been a sort of huge mobilization of civil society, so lots of volunteers turning up, small grassroots organizations kind of turning up, advice centers sort of popping up. So there is a lot of help to be found when people get to some of these cities. But yes, they do, by all reports, seem to be running out of space to accommodate people. The mayors of Krakow and Warsaw said that they had started to be unable to find places to accommodate people. I think Warsaw had received 300,000 at the end of last week. It was, I think, around 300,000 people. Krakow, it was 100,000, and they obviously weren't in the place to sort of suddenly find accommodation for all the people that wanted to stay, because obviously people want to stay in the two larger cities because they see it as a place where they could find jobs, where their kids can go to school, many different reasons. Maybe they have family nearby. So there started to be, I saw posters in some of the train stations in Warsaw suggesting that people go to smaller Polish cities, and information being put out to try and give people confidence that if they went to these smaller cities, help would be available, places to stay would be available, and that they would be safe there. I mean, I guess moving forward, as more people flee, this issue will become greater. There's two sports stadiums being used to accommodate people in Warsaw, and small hostels also being set up by grassroots organizations to try and accommodate people, also non-Ukrainian refugees, which is important because they can often struggle to find accommodation in the way that some Ukrainian refugees may not be able to. It might be easier for some Ukrainian refugees to find accommodation. So moving forward, the space issue is going to be huge, and dealing with all the needs, medical, psychological, basic needs that everyone has who are arriving is going to grow. I mean, the train stations will continue. I think it seems to be a huge hub of people arriving, people sleeping, staying, not sure where to go next. I mean, when we were there at Krakow train station, people had rolling mats, they were sleeping on the floor. Volunteers there told me that people weren't staying for longer than a night. They were usually getting a train somewhere else. But I think the train stations, particularly in Warsaw and Krakow, really were a point where people were arriving fully after having crossed the border and starting to try and figure out what to do next. And I think there was a real sense of both of those places when I was there, of people suddenly coming to terms with having to figure out what they were doing. And
but it seems like, sorry to interrupt, but in a sense, I mean, at this point the reception seems to be going relatively successful. The similar mobilization I see and observe in Berlin as well. But are there any plans within these cities, at least in Poland, which right now started to host the largest majority of the people arriving from Ukraine? Are there plans how to kind of integrate the system? You know, the director allows everything. We'll talk about this temporary directive in a minute, but it allows the people to arrive. But then, are there any plans to actually realize this to happen in the future? Today, I heard von der Leyen in the morning. She said that they are creating this new care package. I think, what is it called? I have to look at it, but I think it's called Cohesion Action for Refugees who are from particularly Ukraine, to allow them to access, you know, social economic rights, basically. But I'm curious to see if, you know, in Poland, did you see any structural planning I don't know if the right word is, but to observe what's happening, what's going to happen?
Personally, no, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. I mean, I'm aware that a number of Ukrainian kids are already in Polish schools, so there is some movement towards integration already. I don't know if the others are more informed on that, but there probably are steps, but I didn't see it.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add?
I mean, I think it's important to mention that, like, there is like a huge kind of organization by individual Polish citizens and small organizations to help. Like, there's been a huge kind of initiative on the ground, which is kind of self-led in the sense of it's not kind of big government authorities. It's kind of people just turning up and helping. And I think that's really impressive thing to witness. And you know, many people I spoke to at the train stations just said, I had to come and help. I couldn't do nothing. You know, one guy told me a woman from Lviv arrived with her kids and was crying and didn't know where to go and had nowhere to sleep. So, you know, he called up his wife and just said, I'm bringing them home with me for tonight. And then they later were able to make their way to Spain. So there is a lot of people giving up huge amounts of time working across the weekend, juggling multiple jobs as well as volunteering. So I think there is a lot of help to be found, at least in a sort of individual basis.
Yeah, thank you. I'll first start asking Franzi to you, but then I'd like Petra to comment on this as well. So when three of you were together there, which borders were you able to monitor? And Franzi, in very importantly, you commented to underline this is indeed a crisis, but foremost, you know, first, it's a crisis for the people who are fleeing their homes, and then maybe we can also consider this is a huge issue for the receiving countries, maybe EU in the long run as well. But when you were at the borders, can you tell us what you observed at the border as people crossed?
Yeah, thank you for having us today, Begüm. So yeah, we were, the three of us were together for 10 days actually, starting in Hungary, going through the border to Slovakia, and then ending in Poland, where Katy then also stayed longer. And I think starting like this is very personal observations that I can tell you what I observed, or what we also in the group discussed a few times. So this is also echoing what Petra and Katy were telling me in the car, or things that we observed on the go. So I think what I realized in the beginning was the silence on these train stations. It was when a train arrived and people were actually leaving the train to be registered in Hungary, and there we were at the train station in Záhony, and it was utterly silent, and people had barely anything on them. They maybe had a stroller, they maybe had a little backpack, they maybe had a little bag full of bread, or other random items, like the chain of a dog, or a cage for the cat. But they did not really have any essential belongings where you would say, okay, like, you are leaving your house and you're starting a new life, and what do you take? And basically what you could really see is that it was the bare essentials that people took. And there was also this mood of shock still, and not realizing what actually had happened. But you could see in the faces of the people that there was a crack that happened, right? There was a disruption of life that, coming from the perspective on what I've seen in Lesbos or other camp situations, let's see, in the last years, is something it was new to me, as an outsider, to actually see the immediacy of the war still in the faces of the people in the camps. You see the silence in a different way. You see the waiting and the traces of the waiting, and this prolonged uncertainty still. And there it was really clear that people were in shock, and that also made it difficult, actually, as a journalist, for me to know, like, how can I talk to people without immediately, like, you don't want to hold a microphone in front of them and ask them, so how are you feeling now? Because, like, I mean, they basically just crossed the border, so it was just meters away that they left this home or this place. So there was, and then it had different forms, right? So some people, they were still very, very hopeful. They thought, okay, maybe I can go back to my home in 2 or 3 days or weeks, and they still had the keys of their house in their pockets. So, that it was just like, look, I'm still going to the sports studio on Thursdays, it's still running, like, life is still running. Where am I supposed to go? So these were students, these were mothers and grandmothers, and people who were just arriving at the train station with not knowing where actually to end up next Thursday, So so it had different, it all had different forms, I think. And this was very, I think this was very personal also, and how everybody experienced that differently. But of course, I think what was also visibly a picture that what could be seen a lot was that it was, of course, women and children mainly that would arrive, because men between 18 and 60 were banned from leaving the country. Other than if you have exceptions, for example, if you have a disabled child, or if you're the only caretaker, you could leave the country. But that also was something that added to the to the suffering of the people that just crossed. Because what we heard also from the other side of the border is that a lot of, let's say, families try to bring their young sons through the border, but then the border police would take them out of the cars, or would tell them that they have to join the army, and so on. So there were like dramatic scenes on the other side of the borders, right? So when people actually arrived, that's, I guess, why it was also so silent, right? That you just realize, okay, now it's you have another challenge ahead. But so yeah, I mean, it has all different elements, I think, to that. What I think could be seen in the beginning was that a lot of people who left actually had family in Europe, had siblings to go to, had friends to go to. And then with the days that were passing, you could see more and more people also arriving who did not maybe have direct relatives who would pick them up at the train stations or so. And there was a big uncertainty involved. However, what I think was also quite visible at that time was that there was not an immediate response on the state level with, let's say, tent camps or housing people in temporary shelters. I mean, of course, I think this is just going to come now more and more, and just what Katy also touched upon now, that this is a reality that with 2.7 million people fleeing, of course, this will rise to a reality too. But what you could also observe, of course, is that it was possible, and that 27 EU country states actually agreed to take in people and to grant asylum without any boundaries, especially in the beginning. Yeah, so this is kind of a first. There's much more to say, but I think Petra also.
Yeah. No, Petra, I want to combine this question with you if you have the space also to talk about, because I mean, Katy mentioned a little bit of the reception conditions, at least in Poland. But you know, a lot of people are arriving from all across Europe at these borders, and you know, interested in kind of helping the situation. But I was wondering also, how do the people who have been living in these borderlands are also feeling? What is the perception of, you know, there is a kind of general mobilization to support people fleeing the war in Ukraine. But of course, there's a kind of an immediacy of the feeling at these border towns. So I'm also interested in hearing if you have any observations, comments on how these neighboring towns also were feeling and experiencing, besides, you know, opening up their kind of meals to share.
Great, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, I mean, I think what was really interesting for our trip is that we really got a sense of kind of a comparative perspective, because we started off in Hungary, then went to Slovakia, and then went to Poland. And you know, for me, what struck me was that there was so much similarity and yet so much difference in terms of how the response was kind of being felt and experienced. And I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think when we look at borderlands generally and the kind of communities that are around borders, they're such fascinating places. And in this part of the world, unfortunately, a lot of the communities are also quite economically depressed, or they're very small. There's little villages that kind of dot the landscape. And these villages actually ended up being a lot of the reception centers, like a village that we visited in Hungary that basically turned an old community center and a school into a reception center with food, with diaper collection, with all these wonderful things that were being collected for people leaving Ukraine. But there was also a lot of disorganization in many ways. I mean, it makes me think of our experiences in Slovakia. We went to the Vyšné Německé crossing, which is the city that basically is bisected with Uzhgorod on the Ukrainian side. And a lot of people were crossing by foot or by car there. And again, it was amazing to see the level of solidarity and food and all these groups coming. I mean, we even saw a private helicopter, actually 2 helicopters, land and take people all the way, you know, from the Czech Republic, basically. So lots of really innovative, creative ways that people are stepping up, but also a lot of disorganization. And we started feeling it almost, and others have made this comparison too, it felt a bit almost like a fairground, like a spectacle or a theater of solidarity. And there's something kind of sticky and uncomfortable about that too. You know, we saw, for example, often single men just coming up from places like Germany, holding up placards saying, you know, rides to Munich, but no kind of virtual checks into their background, who they were. We were concerned about a human trafficking situation in one specific case that was quite visceral for us. I mean, again, I think it just goes to show there's a lot of goodwill in these crisis situations, but the management of it can really lead to some broader problems. And then when we went to Poland, I mean, again, I think we've already touched on this, as this situation kind of becomes more protracted, you really do start kind of feeling some of the fissures or the kind of tension that gets built up as more and more people come, as resources are stretched. And there's this kind of sharpening on part of the host communities as well, as people realize that we're not going to be out of this situation anytime soon. And I think that also highlights one of the areas I know we want to talk about today, and that is the kind of differential experiences that people have when they cross the border. And it's one thing to talk about an experience that, for example, a young mother and children might have versus a medical student from Nigeria who is crossing the border from Ukraine as well, or a Romani family that is immediately racially profiled at the border and surrounded by, a cadre of police officers like we saw as well. It's very clear that, the border is contextual, even in a crisis, especially in a crisis, I should say.
Thanks. Katy, I think you are also following how UK is responding to all these issues, and UK's migration policies have been, if I'm politely to put, is outrageous in the last few years. So I also want to, we're talking about the EU, but of course UK is a big player. There are a lot of ties to UK from people in Ukraine. So how is England, United Kingdom, is responding to this whole new crisis, to put in quotation?
Yeah, I think it's to call the UK's immigration policies outrageous is a generous kind of interpretation. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean, just as background for people that don't know, although I imagine most people do, immigration was a huge factor in Brexit and continues to be like a huge voting issue in the UK. The UK government would argue that it's continuing its quote-unquote proud tradition of supporting refugees. That proud tradition has translated to a very bureaucratic, lengthy visa application process that has just gone online this week, but has involved many, many, many families across EU member states and non-EU member states being stuck at visa centres, trying to figure out how to apply and bring their loved ones back with them. This is many people I've spoken to who've been long established in the UK, who might have citizenship, who have residency, who have jobs. But I mean, of course, it doesn't really matter whether they are employed or not. The fact is that it seems just that they should be able to bring their family back with them, given that places like Poland have, in spite of its questionable immigration policies, have allowed nearly 2 million people to cross its borders visa-free. So the UK started this new kind of sponsorship program, which means that British people can sponsor to host Ukrainian refugees in their house. I mean, it's still a bit unclear about what exactly this will entail. I mean, actually, my family are one of those who are looking into it as well, but it's also complicated and is, again, a sort of negation of the state's obligation to provide for people by, again, letting civil society and individuals do it for themselves, which is a very, let's say, on-brand thing for this for the British government. I mean, it's chaotic, and again shows a lot of bureaucratic violence and general violence shown towards everyone seeking asylum at British borders, and is of course making headlines now because it's Ukrainians who are white Eastern Europeans. Eastern Europeans still have had a very difficult time in the UK, of course, so it's not to say that it's easy as well, but it's making headlines now, which is important because also we're seeing things like at Calais, which is a very well-known place of transit for people on the move trying to claim asylum in the UK. It's a place of extreme violence in every sense of the word, where people have died on a regular basis trying to get under lorries to get to the UK, who've died on boats in the Channel. And even though many Ukrainians are now experiencing very big issues at Calais too, their experience differs wildly also from many of the people there who are sleeping in tents, getting tear gassed by French riot police. So the answer is complicated to how the British government is responding. There's a lot of goodwill, again, from British people. And also I have to say that, you know, there's been a lot of Brits who've been helping in many areas of refugee policy and advocating. I think there's a lot of goodwill in the UK in general, and which runs in contrast to what the British government, its narrative and what it says the UK is about. The proud tradition of welcoming refugees is, again, a civil society-led tradition, not a one seen at state level. But there has been a huge backlash to the treatment of Ukrainians trying to bring their families. And I think it will be interesting moving forward to see how this impacts at least some level of immigration policy. But for now, the current British government seems to be continuing its proud tradition of denying people the right to seek asylum in the UK.
Thank you. Petra, I'll come back to you because from almost day one, you just mentioned this, so I want to go back to it immediately. We started to see reports of racial discrimination against people at the borders. There were some reports of attacks on the border Polish village to people who just crossed. And then there were also a lot of accounts from the Ukrainian side. So, and if I'm correct, you were there as part of the UN Special Rapporteur on Discrimination, right? If I'm telling the name correctly, to collect evidence on racial discrimination. So what were your observations? What were the reports on this?
Yeah, so I was there to monitor the situation generally, and then also to collect some evidence from my colleague, Professor Tendaya Chume, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on Discrimination, and a few other civil society groups that look at systemic racism and border regimes. I mean, you know, the border as a construct, not to get too philosophical, but it's inherently discriminatory and is predicated on systemic racial profiling and categorization, and it's something that is inherently violent, mostly towards racialized communities. And unfortunately, the current situation really shows that, given what is, for example, happening in Poland as a case study. You know, you have an open border policy towards people fleeing Ukraine, and yet a few hours north at the Polish-Belarusian border, people are still trapped in an inaccessible corridor that, you know, human rights monitors or journalists are still not allowed to enter. Some of us were there earlier last year, and it's a horrific situation where people are still continually pushed back to the Belarusian territory and not allowed to come into the EU space at all. Yeah. So again, borders are differentially experienced. And I mean, when I was speaking with people and just, you know, collecting evidence on the situation generally, it's a mixed bag, as these things always are. You know, it really depends on who you speak with and what their experience is. And it's also important to not paint all of this with a really broad brush. But there are definitely elements of racial discrimination, particularly within Ukraine when people were trying to flee. We met with a lot of medical students or dentistry students who were studying in Ukraine and living there for many years, who spoke about situations where, for example, Ukrainian women and children were prioritized to get on trains. And a lot of this also had to do, though, with the disorganization on part of, for example, their embassies, where it seemed like certain embassies over others had figured out just the messaging and information that was being shared with people in a different way, whereas others felt like they were kind of abandoned in cities like Kharkiv and others along the eastern frontier there. But again, I mean, a lot of this is historical too. And I really just want to bring up the example of the Roma community, because there's so much ingrained deep anti-Roma sentiment in this part of the world. And Ukraine in particular hosts a huge population of Ukrainian Roma who are Ukrainian citizens also. They have the same, if we look at it from a, you know, an immigration law perspective, they have the same status that any other Ukrainian would have. And yet already there's been countless reports of Roma families being discriminated against, not being given access to food, water, accommodation to the same level that others that are fleeing Ukraine. So again, it's really reifying this idea that there is a particular type of good refugee that we can all wrap our minds around, and everyone else that doesn't fit is kind of relegated to the sidelines at best and violently pushed back and repressed at worst. And unfortunately, again, I think what's perhaps hard for all of us who work in this space for many years now is that there's this kind of cognitive dissonance, I think, that happens where you really are so touched and moved by the amazing show of solidarity and helpfulness and kindness and beauty that can be found in these spaces. But then how do we square that with the ongoing border violence that we all still continually work on at different parts of, the border regime in Europe or globally speaking? I mean, pushbacks are still happening. Technological violence is still happening. Deaths are still happening at the border. And so it's really, really hard to square these kind of two experiences, because at the end of the day, border is always arbitrary and it's often a violent experience for those who have to cross it.
Thank you. Franzi, now back to you. You said that you still have more things to say from your observations at the border. So I'd like you to continue maybe reflecting on both Petra's comments and Katy's, but also maybe in the end, if you have observed a little bit, maybe you can also add on a little bit of the German context as well. If you were able to follow a little bit. If not, I'll just have you, just in case, like I didn't prep you for that. So I'm just still very eager to hear your own experiences and to explain more.
Yeah, I think it's great what like Katy and Petra just said, especially about like how inherent you could see that the violence actually is at the borders, right? And I think that what we also realize, and also with the risk of getting too philosophical, is that there is no foreign suffering, right? There is just this luck that you might not have experienced that displacement yet in your life, and I hope nobody has to. But there is something where you. And this is like an echo that I could see also returning back to Lesbos now, that you basically give, as soon as you cross this border and you leave your home, you give the control over your life away. And I don't want to actually compare the suffering of people. This is not what it's about. It's about like how, of course, the governments or people respond to those who are crossing. And this has been quite schizophrenic sometimes, actually, being at that border and seeing that there were billboards where it said like Poland is welcoming you, and this is the Wi-Fi password, and here you have a bag of diapers, and here you have I don't know, a voucher for the next 10 days in a hotel. And that's just something that I think struck all of us quite deeply, because we have all been there 6 months ago at the Polish-Belarusian border. And just what Petra also said is that, and I think, Petra, you also checked, right? It's like the extension of the rule of exception on that border is until, I think, June or July, that no human rights lawyer, no journalist, no independent observer can actually access this forest strip where there is still dozens of people being pushed back every day. And this is also something that happens simultaneously, and not only from the Polish side, but also from the Belarusian soldiers who are pushing people right now violently into Ukrainian territory or like to Polish territory, right? So you have a state that is spending 53 million euros now in creating a border wall on the southern borderline in Poland, while you have billboards saying welcome people in need, which is how it should be. And this is something also that Katy pointed out very well in one of her tweets, I think, on the border, where she I think you had, you can maybe add on that later, but when you saw like, okay, there's actually like a guideline on how to seek protection suddenly, and there were these leaflets given out, and something we have just not seen in the last years, moving in these border areas with people. And I think that's and I come back to Germany in a second, but actually what is really striking me at the moment is returning actually to Lesbos, which is an island which was kind of the symbol of the so-called peak of the migration movement in 2015 and 16, and where we can see how human rights, like international law, national law, and European law, can be bent and broken in order to actually deter people arriving for safety in Europe, and how this has been brutalized in so absurd ways that, you know, at the moment we have scenarios here on the island that I sometimes have to tell to myself that this is actually happening right now, you know, which is, for example, that there is 2 young Afghan asylum seekers on trial right now who were charged for 50 years because they were charged for aiding illegal entry in 2020 in March when they arrived, and they claim that their boat was actually turned over by the Greek Coast Guards and violated, and they were ending up in the waters. They were then picked up by the Greek Coast Guards and brought to the shore, and there they were arrested. And since then, these 2 are in detention, and the court case has just been postponed yet again. And it's just showcasing a lot of, you know, this turnover of a justice system in order to have an architecture of deterrence on these borders that are just really designed to scare people away to seek protection here. And then at the same time, there was a funeral of 6 people who were found dead on the shore, on the southern shore of Lesbos on the 1st of March, actually on the same morning when I drove to the airport to get to the Hungarian border. I drove past a police scene, and I didn't know until we all met in Thessaloniki that these were 7 people actually that arrived dead in the same spot at that morning. So, you know, there is like, but nobody actually knows their names, you know, and that's the thing. Like, there was no media attention on that too, because of course also, and that's something we also have to talk about on how media works in that borderlands. And I also, I mean, I wasn't there, and the story is also not about me, but you know, it's like, it's just happening very parallel to one another, and in such a drastic way that, yeah, it's also sometimes hard to put it in words, as I actually realize now that it's an ongoing story, it's a developing story. And coming just shortly to Germany, I think what could be seen is that people who were actually in solidarity in 2015-16 already were now also again going to the train stations and welcoming people. And I think there was also a bit of a chaotic response at the beginning of saying, oh yeah, okay, I can maybe host a family, but then realizing 5 days after, you know, that it's maybe too quick of a move. And I think this is also something that people are adjusting to at this point right now. But you could also see there was a movement of solidarity, which was refreshing to see personally, because I felt that there was also a big fatigue after 15 and 16, and a lot of things just got lost in political debates. And just on another point now, it's like, if we compare the numbers of nearly 3 million people who have crossed in like just over 2 weeks, you know, and the people who are actually arriving here now, it's a scale that doesn't, you know, that cannot be compared. But yet those people who are being violently pushed back, they are still, you know, mostly criminalized in the media. They are mostly, you know, segregated in so many brutal ways, and talked about in completely different shapes and colors. So that's also something that we actually have to stick with the facts. And yeah, that would show a lot on what is actually possible. We could also see with the Ukrainian people fleeing now. and how they should be hosted. You know, that's also gave a lot of hope at the same time.
On here, I want to go back to Katy and ask first if there's anything you want to add to what Franzi was saying, but I want to ask about your other reporting on human trafficking, because also we are hearing of a lot of instances where people are being trafficked, and this is also being talked in Berlin as well. I mean, there are also discussions that these things are maybe to a lesser extent happening in the train stations in Germany as well. But I want to see what your reporting was talking about in terms of human trafficking, children actually going missing, and the, you know, I think one of you mentioned, now I get confused, that the impossibility of vetting, that there's this chaos and there's no way of like actually checking every single person that they are opening their homes. So this actually, on one hand, from what I read around, the majority seems to be a great goodwill and everybody actually wants to help. But there are some cases which still needs to be taken into serious consideration to protect children and others from being trafficked. So can you tell us about a bit of your reporting, and if you have anything to add to Franzi?
Sure. So, I mean, like you said, I think the majority of people turning up, offering lifts at the borders are well-meaning, just want to help. But of course, this was actually triggered by something that we witnessed at the Slovakian border, where we had serious concerns about a young woman who just crossed alone. In fact, she was 19 years old, who had been offered a ride with a single man who was much older, who just we did not have a good impression of. And this kind of sparked this concern about, which many other people have spoken about the vulnerability of people crossing when they first arrive, and because of the chaotic nature at the borders, because there just are so many people crossing. It doesn't stop when the sun goes down. You know, people are crossing at all times, late at night, because a lot of families have to leave their brothers and fathers. You know, there's a lot of young women crossing alone, and this is an issue, definitely. And I've spoken to some people like rights groups, legal organizations working on the ground, who are trying to inform people of how to keep themselves safe. There's a Polish organization, Homophoba, who are working with the border guards, who put leaflets in people's passports when they pass through, trying to make them aware of the risks of human trafficking, not getting in someone's car without having told other people where you're going, the number plate, many other different things that can help reduce this risk. But from what I understand from people I've spoken to, this is happening. And even in these past few days, I've had more reports of women who are being trafficked, and cases in which there have been volunteers and professional organizations which have intervened to stop this happening. It is a really troubling thing to witness, just because there are so many people who are turning up who are good people. So it's not the majority of people, but there are criminals at work for sure. And on the issue of children going missing, that's a huge issue, because some parents are, from what I understand, you know, putting their kids on trains to cross alone because they can't leave for whatever reason, and maybe they've got a contact who's going to pick them up, for example, on the Polish border, who's a bit late or doesn't turn up in time, or they're entrusting their kids to friends or other contacts to take them across the border. And from what I understand, children are going missing. In fact, I know children are going missing. I've heard of multiple cases in the past week where children have disappeared crossing the border or just before they've crossed the border. And it's very difficult then, once they've entered, to figure out where they've gone, because once you're in the EU, you can very easily then cross to other countries without sort of being checked, which is an issue when you're trying to track a missing child. So yes, it's a huge problem and a very, very worrying issue across all the borders. And there are things being done to try and keep people safe. For example, registering, making sure that there's a registration process when people are offering rides, that license plates are taken, identity cards, passports, to try and reduce this risk. And I know that it is working in some senses, and that there are people who are becoming increasingly vigilant, and it's being talked about more and more. But yes, it's important to note that a lot of the people crossing are just exhausted, and the first thing you want to do is just find somewhere safe and warm, and the idea of someone out there to harm you isn't crossing people's minds initially because you've just fled a war. So it's important that people are being informed, and they are being informed on quite a big scale, but obviously the amount of people crossing makes it very difficult to inform everyone.
Yeah, so actually what you say is very important, that the responsibility is actually on the shoulders of people who are establishing the solidarity networks, to watch out for the context, watch out for the reception, rather than people being on alert as they arrive as they escape from war, to also to monitor this. This is the responsibility of solidarity and states, in a sense. I guess that the security at the borders also need to function actually to provide security for once, I guess. But I was also like hearing that this wasn't, as soon as this issue came out a couple weeks ago, I was also reading into remembering that Ukraine and Russia were already like important hubs of human trafficking long before these things. So I read that Ukrainian authorities have taken some measures to prevent human trafficking in Ukraine, but also I think I was wondering if this would also even further increase the risk of trafficking, because there is already existing networks in Ukraine. There's already existing kind of trafficking of young women in general, and children, young boys included. I used to read about these things in the past. I'm not updated, but that was actually for me a bigger concern, because it's not just, it didn't feel like it's taking advantage of the moment, but also what I was wondering if it's coming from an already established network of smuggling and human trafficking as well. But I don't know, of course.
I mean, I can't speak to that actually, because I'm not super informed on the Ukrainian side of how it's working. I've also read reports of what you've mentioned, but I'm aware of speaking to many sort of also state-led or state-supported initiatives which have already been working predating the war on this issue, in Slovakia, in Poland, in Romania, who are already kind of activated before this.
Thank you, Petra. Back to you. Well, I mean, we already started talking about the whole hypocrisy thing of how actually there is differential and there is very clearly discriminatory bordering processes all across Europe, even in the borders that we discussed that we ideally are open. They are not actually all open to everyone in the same way. But of course, from yours and Franzi's comments also, I'm seeing that there's this kind of, I want to seek your opinion, see what you say in terms of like, border, you are working on border tech and surveillance and, all these other issues regards to kind of sharp borders. And I really want to hear your opinion once you've seen this, and still, on the other hand, continue to monitor what's happening on Belarusian border, Greek borders, and even, you might have seen the images in Spain, people, who were just recently trying to cross over, So I guess we have about a few more minutes, so I really would like to see your overall take on this.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think this current moment, it feels quite tectonic and very monumental, but also it's important to integrate it, like you say, into the broader bordering regimes that we've all been working on for years, decades even. And unfortunately, yeah, I mean, we are seeing huge levels of border violence all around Europe, Fortress Europe in particular, right? That kind of construct that we've been fighting against for many years. And also globally speaking, I mean, we're increasingly seeing this kind of sharpening of borders, the introduction of more surveillance, more automation, more technology, making just people on the move, making their journeys much more difficult, and really being in contravention of all sorts of international laws to claim asylum and anti-discrimination and other types of rights as well. I mean, I think given what's happening in Ukraine right now, it's also perhaps a little bit early to tell how this is all going to play out, because currently, again, I think it's really heartening to see the kind of response and the kind of relatively open border process that allows people to flee from the occupation and the war. But time will tell whether that will actually continue, or whether we will also see a hardening and a sharpening of the Ukrainian border frontier, as we see with so many other borders around Europe and indeed around the world. So, I mean, it's an interesting moment in time, though, because I think it also allows us perhaps to really critique border violence writ large and the kind of differential experiences that people have who are migrating, and perhaps using this opportunity as a way to push against this systemic violence that is so inherent in the way that nation states operate around the world. Because if it's possible to have such a warm reception for Ukrainian refugees, then why is it not possible in other instances? I mean, we all know why: racism and discrimination and all sorts of imperialist notions around why particular states are powerful and why others are not. But all I'm saying is that, there are ways, I think, that we can use this moment as a leverage point, perhaps, to push the conversation forward. And as difficult as I think it's been really for so many of us working in this space to see this kind of experience, right? Like to think, wow, if it's possible in this instance, why are people being criminalized for assisting our Syrian and Yemeni friends, right? And being accused of human trafficking when we put our friends from countries like that in our cars? Is that going to happen if we put a Ukrainian in our car as well? I mean, all these things need to be questioned and teased apart, but I do actually think this is an opportunity to really lay bare the discriminatory and racist policies that animate the border logics that we are all steeped in. Whether or not the conversation will actually move forward in any meaningful way, I think that's still an open question. And unfortunately, as this situation progresses, and as people get more tired, and as the space of solidarity once again shrinks, I'm not sure if we are there as a society to fully actually deal with these really complex, intractable issues. But I would like to believe that we are. But I think time will tell.
Yeah, but I'm like, for example, we're in the 6th year of which year of the EU-Turkey deal? I keep I at least at this point I lost track. It's 6th year. And EU-Turkey deal was an ad hoc solution, right? It was to immediately halt the arrivals. And now, in a very reverse situation, we have the triggering of the EU the temporary direct protection directive to allow people to enter, be able to move freely to the places because this new temporary protection allows the Ukrainians to, at least Ukrainian citizens, it's not for all people who were residents of Ukraine. It only includes, for those who are watching, is the Ukrainian citizens, as well as people who have already received refugee status in international protection in Ukraine. The rest, for example, for international students, EU assumes that after a certain amount of time, they should be able to arrange to go back to their home countries. unless they can prove they cannot go back. So there's still the burden of proof. But besides that, there is this kind of reversal of these policies. But again, at the end of the day, they feel ad hoc, without any actually what's going to happen to 3 million people in 3 years, because we don't know. I mean, even today at von der Leyen's brief talk that I was hearing, there is an imagination that there will be a going back home, which I remember 6-7 years ago, I heard the same things about Syria. We have completed the 11th year after the war, and the war is still ongoing. So I'm maybe a couple last words I would like to take from all of you for your general comments that you want to add on this, and or otherwise whatever you want to say for a last couple sentences. Petra, if you want to further finish, you continue, and then I'll have Katy and Franzi.
Sure. I think just perhaps to reiterate that for me, as a lawyer, it just really once again brings home the point of how malleable human rights law is, and how malleable the norms of protection really are, and how context specific they are, because it's clearly very feasible to come up with meaningful mechanisms, right? And yet we choose to not employ them in a variety of contexts. And that is all a choice. It's a political choice that we really need to query. And, again, I don't mean to broaden the conversation beyond Europe, but I think, again, this is a global phenomenon, right? Like, there are colleagues of mine tracking the situation, for example, at US borders, and Ukrainians are exempt, for example, from the Title 42 requirement of being processed in Mexico if you're crossing the Mexico-US border, for example, while Central American people from Haiti have been stuck there for years for processing, right? So it's obvious that this plays out in global contexts as well, and we really need to query how we can really be mindful of what actually the experience is like on the ground, and how we can actually push for some of these laws and policies to work in reality, while they're, of course, underpinned by huge power differentials that remain in place.
Thank you. Yeah. Katy?
So I think what I would say is that, like as everyone else has said, it's the hypocrisy which is quite leaves a really bad taste to witness, and I think it just shows this pan-European gaslighting that's been happening for years for people working in this field, but most importantly, the people who are arriving at Europe's borders to claim asylum, that Europe doesn't have space, that it's not possible, that you're not welcome because we can't simply manage to host you in any sort of meaningful long-term way. Of course, as you mentioned, moving forward, it will be important to see how Ukrainians are treated 2, 3, 10 years down the line. But this response at different borders is deeply troubling to witness, and also important to mention that even as we speak, there is ongoing violence at many European borders who are simultaneously welcoming Ukrainians with open arms, and people are still dying. And I think it's really important that Brussels and non-member states, including the UK, take a long, hard look at themselves in the mirror and figure out what exactly they do stand for, because it's very, very, very troubling to witness the two faces of many countries right now.
Yeah. Franzi? Hold on. You're muted, huh?
I think just very shortly, actually, what gives me a notion of hope is that, what we can also see today again is that being a refugee is such a label, right? And that's maybe used in so many ways already. But I think that's also something that we could see now, and that is also a part of warfare, right? That you actually use people, you subjectify people, and you use them as as we could see in many headlines now, the weaponization of asylum seekers and people who want to cross, but not to actually see them as individuals who seek protection and life and joy, and work and family, and in a community which is safe, and that everybody in this world is just, has the right to live in, and that's just something that, you know, I think we also shouldn't forget, that with everything, with all the bad stuff that is happening, it's also people that are behind it, and they give a lot of hope. And if I think not to get too tired of that and to keep on listening, I think that's something at least that gives me a lot of hope for the time to come also.
Thank you, guys. We're already beyond our time, so I'm again grateful to have 3 of you at the same time on my screen to be able to speak to you all. I really appreciate your time, and I know that I'm going to see you very soon, all of you. So thanks again.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone who watched us on The Move. In 2 weeks, again on Sunday, we'll be here on Medyascope Plus. Thank you for watching us, and have a good Sunday.